I stood on my childhood doorstep as my father screamed, "Go live in the streets." His voice cracked with years of accumulated disappointment. My mother Helen clutched her purse, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks, but she remained silent. 28 years of what they perceived as my failures culminated in this devastating moment. They believed their son was a complete failure who had dropped out of college and bounced between meaningless, dead-end jobs. What they didn't know was that I had secretly built a technology empire worth $15 million. As cardboard boxes filled with my belongings crashed onto the concrete pavement, I simply smiled, calmly pulled out my phone, and called my private driver. The black Mercedes pulled up to the curb within minutes, just as I knew it would. My driver, Thomas, stepped out, his professional demeanor never wavering despite the obvious family drama unfolding before him. As we loaded my few possessions into the trunk, I caught my father Robert watching from the living room window, his face a mixture of anger and something that might have been regret. "Where to, Mr. Patterson?" Thomas asked as we settled into the leather interior. "Home," I replied, though the word felt strange after what had just happened. The penthouse apartment in downtown Seattle had been my real home for 3 years now, but I had never truly acknowledged it until this moment. As the city lights blurred past the tinted windows, my mind drifted back to how this all began. 5 years ago, I was a junior at Washington State University studying computer science when I first discovered cryptocurrency. While my classmates were focused on getting good grades to impress future employers, I was staying up all night researching blockchain technology, mining algorithms, and market patterns. My parents, Helen and Robert, owned Patterson Accounting Services, a modest firm they had built over 30 years of careful, conservative financial management. They represented everything traditional about American middle-class values. Work hard, follow the rules, and success will come through established channels. When I tried to explain cryptocurrency to them during Christmas dinner in my sophomore year, Robert had dismissed it as fake computer money for criminals. That conversation should have been a warning. Instead of trying to bridge the gap between their world and mine, I made a decision that would define the next 5 years of my life. I would build my empire in secret, living modestly, working odd jobs to maintain appearances, all while hoping that someday I could present my success in a way that would finally make them proud. The decision to drop out came during my junior year when my cryptocurrency trading platform, CoinBridge, started processing its first $1 million in daily transactions. I couldn't focus on classes when I was managing a business that demanded my full attention. My parents saw the withdrawal from school as the final proof of my inability to commit to anything meaningful. For the next 3 years, I lived a double life that would have impressed any undercover agent. During the day, I worked at Peterson's hardware store, making $12 an hour and coming home with grease under my fingernails. My parents would shake their heads at dinner, making subtle comments about finding direction and taking responsibility. Meanwhile, my nights were spent in a rented garage that served as CoinBridge's first headquarters, working with a small team of developers I had recruited from online forums. CoinBridge wasn't just another cryptocurrency exchange. We had developed proprietary algorithms that could predict market fluctuations with 87% accuracy, making us invaluable to institutional investors who needed stable, secure trading platforms. By my 25th birthday, we were processing $50 million in transactions daily. By 26, major banks were calling. The irony was devastating. While my parents worried about my $12 an hour salary, I was signing contracts worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. While they encouraged me to network and make connections, I was having dinner meetings with executives from Goldman Sachs and J.P. Morgan Chase. The modest Toyota Camry I drove to family dinners was parked next to my Porsche in the private garage beneath my penthouse. My phone buzzed as we approached downtown. My assistant Jennifer was calling from our offices in the Columbia Center, Seattle's tallest building. "Grady, congratulations." Her voice was excited. The Federal Reserve just approved our application for expanded institutional services. We're officially cleared to handle government transactions. The contract is worth $12 million annually. I closed my eyes and leaned back against the headrest. While my father was throwing my belongings onto the street, calling me worthless, I had just secured the largest contract in CoinBridge's history. The timing felt like a cruel joke from the universe. Thank you, Jennifer. We'll celebrate tomorrow. Right now, I need some time to process everything. Of course. Should I cancel your meetings for tomorrow? No, keep everything on schedule. This is too important to let personal issues interfere. As we pulled into the underground garage of my building, I realized that my parents' rejection had inadvertently given me something I had been avoiding for years: the freedom to stop hiding who I really was. No more hardware store shifts. No more pretending to struggle with rent. No more careful budgeting at family dinners while I had millions sitting in investment accounts. The elevator rose silently to the 40th floor, carrying me toward a life I had built but never fully inhabited. My apartment overlooked Elliott Bay, with floor-to-ceiling windows that showcased the Olympic Mountains in the distance. The modern furniture, imported art, and state-of-the-art technology represented everything my parents thought I could never achieve. But as I stood in my empty living room, surrounded by the trappings of success, I felt more alone than I ever had in my life. 3 days after my parents threw me out, their carefully constructed world began to crumble in ways they never could have imagined. I learned about their troubles through my old friend Marcus, who still lived in the neighborhood and whose mother was friends with mine. The information came in fragments, passed through the informal network of concerned neighbors who had watched our family drama unfold. Helen had always been the emotional center of our household, but she was also the one who handled the stress of running Patterson Accounting Services alongside my father. Their business had been built on trust and personal relationships, serving small businesses and families in our community for 3 decades. They weren't wealthy, but they were stable, respected, and proud of the reputation they had earned through honest work. Thompson Construction had been their biggest client for 8 years. Dave Thompson was a local contractor who specialized in residential remodeling and small commercial projects. His account represented nearly 30% of Patterson Accounting's annual revenue. More importantly, Robert and Dave had developed a genuine friendship built around their shared love of fishing and their similar backgrounds as self-made small business owners. What my parents didn't know was that Dave Thompson had been using their accounting services to legitimize an increasingly sophisticated embezzlement scheme. While Patterson Accounting dutifully filed his tax returns and managed his payroll, Dave was systematically stealing from his clients' material budgets, insurance payouts, and subcontractor payments. He had created a web of shell companies and false invoices that my parents had processed in good faith, trusting their longtime clients' documentation. The scheme unraveled on a Tuesday morning when 3 of Dave's clients simultaneously discovered major discrepancies in their project budgets. By Wednesday afternoon, Dave Thompson had emptied his business accounts and disappeared, leaving behind a trail of unpaid bills, angry customers, and my parents holding financial documents that made them appear complicit in his crimes. The phone call from the Internal Revenue Service came first. Agent Patricia Williams informed my father that Patterson Accounting Services was being investigated for their role in processing fraudulent business expenses and failing to report suspicious financial activity. The penalties for their involvement, even if unintentional, could reach $200,000. Robert tried to explain that they had simply processed the documentation Dave provided, but Agent Williams was unsympathetic. Mr. Patterson, as certified public accountants, you have a responsibility to verify the legitimacy of the transactions you process. Your signatures are on these forms. The second blow came from Dave's victims, who were now pursuing civil lawsuits against anyone associated with his financial operations. Patterson Accounting Services was named in 4 separate suits, with damages totaling over $300,000. Even if they could prove their innocence, the legal fees alone would bankrupt their small firm. My mother, Helen, absorbed each piece of devastating news like physical blows. She had always taken pride in their reputation for integrity and accuracy. The suggestion that they might have been unknowingly involved in criminal activity shattered something fundamental in her understanding of their life's work. On Thursday evening, as Robert was meeting with their attorney to discuss their limited options, Helen collapsed in their kitchen while preparing dinner. The chest pains and difficulty breathing sent her to Harborview Medical Center in an ambulance, with neighbors calling Robert to meet them at the emergency room. Dr. Sarah Kim, the cardiologist who examined Helen, explained that she was suffering from acute stress-induced cardiac symptoms. "Mrs. Patterson, your heart is healthy, but the stress you're experiencing is manifesting in very real physical symptoms. You need to find ways to reduce the pressure you're under, or these episodes will become more frequent and potentially more serious." Robert sat beside Helen's hospital bed, holding her hand while machines monitored her vital signs. Their 30-year marriage had weathered many challenges, but nothing had prepared them for the simultaneous destruction of their business, reputation, and financial security. The medical bills were already accumulating, adding to their growing mountain of debt. "Maybe we should call Grady," Helen whispered during one of Robert's visits. "No." Robert's response was immediate and firm. "We created this mess ourselves, and well handle it ourselves. Besides, what could he do? He doesn't even have a real job." Helen wanted to argue, but she lacked the energy. The medications made her drowsy, and the weight of their problems felt crushing. She closed her eyes and tried to remember better times, when their biggest worry was whether Grady would pass his college courses. Meanwhile, I was monitoring their situation through channels they never would have suspected. Marcus kept me informed through his mother's reports, but I also had other sources of information. My success in the financial technology world had connected me with professionals throughout Seattle's business community, including several people who knew about my parents' troubles. Dr. Kim, who treated my mother, was married to James Kim, a software engineer who had worked briefly for CoinBridge during our expansion phase 2 years earlier. When James mentioned the Patterson case during a dinner conversation, Dr. Kim realized the connection and discreetly provided updates on my mother's condition through her husband. The knowledge was torturous. Every instinct told me to write a check that would solve their immediate problems, but I knew they would never accept help from the son they considered a failure. Even worse, offering assistance would require admitting that I had been living a lie for years, which would add betrayal to their list of grievances against me. Patterson Accounting Services continued to deteriorate as clients learned about the investigation and lawsuits. Several long-term customers canceled their contracts, afraid of being associated with potential financial crimes. The business that had taken 3 decades to build was disintegrating in a matter of weeks. I spent sleepless nights in my penthouse, staring out at the city lights while calculating exactly how much money would be needed to save their business and restore their reputation. $12 million sat in my primary investment account, earning more in monthly interest than my parents made in a full year. Yet I was powerless to help them, trapped by the wall of pride and misunderstanding that separated us. The irony was almost unbearable. I had built a fortune by understanding market patterns and predicting financial outcomes, but I couldn't find a way to solve the most important problem in my personal life. Success had given me everything except the ability to reconnect with the people who mattered most. Robert's desperation grew with each passing day as the walls closed in around Patterson Accounting Services. The IRS investigation had frozen their business accounts pending resolution of the case, leaving them unable to pay their office, rent, utilities, or remaining employees. Sarah, their bookkeeper for 15 years, had reluctantly accepted a position with another firm after Robert could no longer guarantee her salary. The legal fees were mounting faster than Robert had imagined possible. Their attorney, David Brennan, was charging $300 per hour for his services, and the complex nature of their case required extensive research into financial regulations and fraud liability. After 2 weeks, Brennan had already billed $12,000, with no end in sight. Helen remained in the hospital for observation after suffering 2 additional stress-related episodes. The medical bills were accumulating daily, and their insurance coverage included high deductibles and co-payments that they couldn't afford. Robert found himself juggling between visiting his wife, meeting with lawyers, and desperately searching for solutions to their impossible financial situation. It was during one of these frantic afternoons that Robert made the decision that would nearly destroy what remained of their lives. Walking through downtown Seattle after another discouraging meeting with his attorney, he noticed a small storefront with bright yellow signs advertising Quick Cash Solutions, CSS, fast approval, no credit checks, immediate funding. The office was located in a rundown building between a pawn shop and a check cashing service. Robert had never imagined himself walking into such a place, but desperation has a way of reshaping a person's boundaries. The receptionist, a young woman with elaborate nail art and a bored expression, handed him a clipboard with a simple application form. Tony Marcelli, the loan officer who reviewed Robert's application, was a short, stocky man in his 40s who wore expensive suits that didn't quite conceal his rough edges. His office was decorated with sports memorabilia and photographs of himself with various minor celebrities, creating an atmosphere of questionable legitimacy. "Mr. Patterson, I see you need $50,000 to handle some temporary business challenges," Tony said, reviewing the paperwork. "Based on your property value and business history, we can definitely work with you." Robert felt a surge of relief. "What's the interest rate?" Tony's smile revealed gold dental work. "Well, this is a specialized financial product for people in urgent situations. The rate is 28% annually, but we're very flexible about payment schedules." 28% was highway robbery, but Robert was desperate. He signed the papers without fully understanding the terms, focusing only on the promise of immediate cash to keep his business afloat and pay Helen's medical bills. What Robert didn't realize was that Quick Cash Solutions was a front operation for a loan sharking business with connections to organized crime. The 28% rate was just the beginning. Hidden in the fine print were penalty clauses, processing fees, and acceleration provisions that could quickly spiral out of control. While Robert was signing papers that would put his family in physical danger, Helen was having an unexpected conversation in her hospital room. Jake Patterson, my old college roommate who worked as a physician's assistant at Harborview, had been assigned to her case during the night shift. Jake recognized the last name immediately and asked Helen if she was related to Grady Patterson. When she confirmed that I was her son, Jake's expression changed dramatically. "Mrs. Patterson, I think there might be some misunderstanding about your son's situation," Jake said carefully. "Grady and I were roommates at WSU, and I've been following his career in the tech industry. Are you aware of his involvement with CoinBridge?" Helen had no idea what CoinBridge was, but Jake's tone suggested it was significant. "I'm afraid I don't know much about Grady's work. We haven't been in close contact recently." Jake hesitated, clearly uncomfortable about revealing information that wasn't his to share. "Mrs. Patterson, without violating Grady's privacy, I can tell you that your son has been very successful in the financial technology sector. You might want to do some research on CoinBridge when you're feeling better." After Jake left her room, Helen lay awake thinking about his words. She had always assumed that Grady's reluctance to discuss his work in detail was because he was embarrassed about his lack of success. The possibility that she might have misunderstood the situation entirely was both hope-inducing and terrifying. The next morning, Helen asked her nurse to help her access the hospital's computer system for patients. Her hands shook as she typed Grady Patterson CoinBridge into the search engine. The results that appeared on the screen made her feel dizzy with shock. Article after article described her son as a cryptocurrency pioneer, a financial technology innovator, and a rising star in digital banking. Forbes magazine had included him in their 30 under 30 list for financial services. The Wall Street Journal had featured CoinBridge in a major story about the future of institutional cryptocurrency trading. Helen read with growing amazement about the company her son had built from nothing. CoinBridge employed over 200 people and was valued at over $100 million. Grady himself was described as having a personal net worth in the mid-8 figures, which Helen had to look up to understand meant between $10 and $99 million. The photographs accompanying the articles showed a confident, professionally dressed version of her son that she barely recognized. In one image, he was shaking hands with the mayor of Seattle at a technology conference. In another, he was speaking at a panel discussion with executives from major banks. As the full scope of her misunderstanding became clear, Helen felt a complex mixture of emotions that was almost overwhelming. Pride in her son's achievements battled with shame about their treatment of him. Relief that he wasn't the failure they had believed competed with anguish about the years of disappointment they had expressed. She tried to call my number, but my phone was turned off during a series of meetings with federal regulators who were reviewing CoinBridge's application for expanded government services. Her voicemails grew increasingly urgent throughout the day as she tried to reach me while processing the magnitude of their mistake. Meanwhile, Robert was discovering that his deal with Quick Cash Solutions was far more dangerous than he had understood. Tony Marcelli called that evening with news that the $50,000 loan had already accrued additional fees and penalties that brought the total amount due to $62,000. Mr. Patterson, we had to process your application as a high-risk emergency loan, Tony explained with false sympathy. The additional charges are standard for your situation. Robert protested that no one had explained these additional costs, but Tony's tone became less friendly. Sir, everything was clearly disclosed in the paperwork you signed. We expect the first payment of $15,000 by next Friday, or will be forced to take more aggressive collection measures. The mention of aggressive collection measures sent a chill through Robert's spine. He was beginning to realize that he had made a terrible mistake, but he was trapped with no way out. The money was already spent on legal fees and medical bills, and he had no way to raise $15,000 in 1 week. As Helen lay in her hospital bed, desperate to reach her successful son, and Robert faced the growing threat from dangerous lenders, I was completely unaware of the crisis that was engulfing my family. The irony would haunt me for years afterward. While I was negotiating contracts worth millions of dollars, the people I loved most were sliding toward financial and physical danger that I could have easily prevented. Helen's research into my success had opened a floodgate of emotions, but it also filled her with a sense of urgent purpose. Using the hospital's patient computer system, she spent hours reading every article she could find about CoinBridge and my role in the financial technology industry. Each new piece of information deepened her understanding of how completely she and Robert had misjudged their son. The most heartbreaking discovery came when she found an interview I had given to Seattle Business Monthly 18 months earlier. The journalist had asked about my family background and support system. My response, which Helen read through tears, revealed the pain our relationship had caused me over the years. Success in business often requires taking unconventional paths, I had said in the interview. Not everyone in your life will understand your vision, and that includes people you care about deeply. I've learned that sometimes you have to build your dreams quietly until you can demonstrate their value in terms that others can appreciate. When asked specifically about family support, I had been diplomatically vague. My parents are hardworking people who built a successful accounting practice through traditional methods. They've taught me the importance of integrity and persistence, even when we don't always agree about methodology. Helen understood that I had been protecting them, even while discussing my success publicly. Instead of revealing their disapproval and lack of support, I had found a way to speak positively about their influence on my character. The generosity of spirit in my response made her earlier harsh words feel even more shameful. She tried calling my number repeatedly throughout Wednesday, but my phone remained unreachable. What she didn't know was that I was in a series of high-level meetings with officials from the Federal Reserve and the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, discussing CoinBridge's application to provide cryptocurrency services for government agencies. The meetings were taking place in a secure conference room in the Federal Building, where personal phones were not permitted. Jennifer, my assistant, was handling all communications while I participated in discussions that could expand CoinBridge's government contracts by another $30 million annually. While Helen was desperately trying to reach me, Robert was receiving a visit from Quick Cash Solutions that made the true nature of his situation terrifyingly clear. 2 men arrived at the Patterson Accounting Services office on Thursday afternoon, introducing themselves as Vincent and Carlo from the collections department. Vincent was a tall, thin man with pale skin and cold eyes, who spoke in a quiet, measured tone that somehow conveyed more menace than shouting would have. Carlo was shorter and broader, with scarred hands and a way of examining the office that suggested he was cataloging everything for potential seizure. Mr. Patterson, we understand you might be having difficulty meeting your payment obligations, Vincent said, settling into the chair across from Robert's desk uninvited. Our company wants to work with you, but we need to see some good faith effort on your part. Robert's mouth was dry as he tried to maintain his composure. I explained to Mr. Marcelli that I need more time to arrange the payment. My wife is in the hospital, and our business accounts are frozen due to an IRS investigation. Carlo laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. Vincent, this guy thinks his personal problems are our problems. Vincent raised a hand to silence his partner, never taking his eyes off Robert. Mr. Patterson, I sympathize with your difficulties, but business is business. You borrowed $50,000, which with fees and interest now totals $75,000. We need $15,000 by Friday, or we'll be forced to take possession of collateral. What collateral? Robert asked, though he dreaded the answer. Vincent smiled, showing perfect teeth that somehow made him appear more predatory. Your office equipment, your home, your wife's jewelry, whatever it takes to recover our investment. He paused for effect. Of course, if those assets aren't sufficient, we might need to consider other forms of compensation. The threat was clear, without being explicit. Robert understood that he and Helen were in physical danger, but he had no idea how to escape the trap he had created. After Vincent and Carlo left, he sat alone in his office, staring at the framed photographs of better times, wondering how his life had spiraled so completely out of control. Helen's attempts to reach me became increasingly frantic as she sensed that time was running out. She left voicemails explaining her discovery about Coinbridge and begging me to call her back immediately. Her voice, weak from medication but urgent with desperation, conveyed the emotional weight of years of misunderstanding and the immediate danger they were facing. Grady, this is your mother, her final voicemail began. I know you probably don't want to hear from us after what happened, but I've learned some things about your work that I should have known years ago. We've made terrible mistakes, and now we're in serious trouble. Please call me back. We need your help, but more than that, we need to tell you how wrong we've been about everything. By Thursday evening, Robert had exhausted every conventional option for raising the money he needed. Their house was mortgaged beyond its current value due to the housing market decline. Their business assets were frozen by the IRS investigation. Their friends and extended family didn't have the kind of money that could help with such a large debt. In desperation, Robert considered confessing everything to Helen, but her fragile medical condition made him afraid that the shock might trigger another cardiac episode. He felt trapped between protecting his wife's health and protecting both their lives from the consequences of his terrible decision. The loan sharks had given him until Friday afternoon to produce the first payment. As Thursday night turned into Friday morning, Robert realized he was out of time and out of options. He had put his family in mortal danger, and he could see no way to save them. Meanwhile, my meetings with federal regulators were concluding successfully. Coinbridge had passed every security review and compliance audit, clearing the way for government contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars over the next 5 years. As I finally turned on my phone Friday morning, I was expecting congratulatory messages from my team and industry contacts. Instead, I found 12 increasingly desperate voicemails from my mother. The first message confused me. Helen's voice was weak and strained, mentioning something about Coinbridge and asking me to call her back. The subsequent messages grew more urgent, with references to serious trouble and terrible mistakes. By the time I reached her final voicemail, my hands were shaking as I understood that my parents were facing some kind of crisis that required immediate attention. I called Helen's number directly, but it went straight to voicemail. I tried the Patterson Accounting Services line and heard Robert's voice, tight with stress, explaining that they were temporarily unavailable due to family circumstances. Without hesitation, I canceled my scheduled celebration lunch and directed Thomas to drive me to Harborview Medical Center. Whatever was happening to my parents, I was finally in a position to help them, regardless of our recent conflicts. As we raced through Seattle traffic, I had no idea that my family was facing threats that money alone couldn't solve, or that my intervention would require me to risk everything I had built to ensure their safety. I arrived at Harborview Medical Center with my heart pounding, unsure of what I would find, but knowing that my mother's desperate voicemails indicated a crisis far beyond anything I had imagined. The nurse at the cardiac unit desk initially hesitated to provide information about Helen's condition. But when I explained that I was her son, she directed me to room 412. Helen looked smaller and more fragile than I had ever seen her, connected to monitoring equipment that tracked her vital signs with electronic beeps. Her face was pale, but her eyes were alert and filled with a mixture of relief and shame when she saw me enter the room. "Grady," she whispered, struggling to sit up straighter. "Thank God you came." I pulled a chair close to her bed, taking her hand gently. "Mom, what's happening? Your voicemails said you were in trouble." Helen's eyes filled with tears as she began to explain everything she had learned about my success and everything that had happened to their business in the past 2 weeks. The story poured out of her in fragments. Dave Thompson's disappearance, the IRS investigation, the lawsuits, Robert's mysterious absences, and her growing fear that their situation was spiraling beyond control. "We've been so wrong about you," she said, her voice breaking. "All these years, we thought you were wasting your life, and you were building something incredible. We threw you out of our home when we should have been celebrating your achievements." I squeezed her hand, feeling the complex emotions of vindication mixed with deep concern for her condition. "Mom, we can talk about all of that later. Right now, I need to understand exactly what kind of trouble you and Dad are in." Helen explained what she knew about Robert's recent behavior, the secretive phone calls, his nervousness when discussing their financial situation, and his insistence that they had to handle their problems themselves. She suspected he was hiding the true severity of their situation to protect her health, but her intuition told her they were in immediate danger. I spent an hour with Helen, reassuring her that whatever problems they faced could be solved, and promising that our family misunderstandings were in the past. When I left the hospital, I had a clear mission: find out exactly what Robert had done and fix it before any permanent damage occurred. My first call was to Marcus Webb, the attorney who handled Coinbridge's legal affairs. Marcus was a former federal prosecutor who had transitioned into corporate law, bringing with him an understanding of both legitimate business practices and criminal enterprises. I explained the situation with my parents and asked him to investigate Patterson Accounting Services and any recent financial transactions Robert might have made. "Grady, this sounds like your father might have gotten involved with predatory lenders," Marcus warned. "If he borrowed money from the wrong people, this could be extremely dangerous. Give me a few hours to make some calls." While Marcus worked his contacts, I drove to my parents' house in Ballard, where I had grown up and where Robert was presumably trying to solve their problems alone. The modest 2-story home looked exactly as I remembered it, but the atmosphere felt different. The lawn needed cutting, and several days' worth of newspapers lay scattered on the front porch. I knocked on the door, but there was no answer. Robert's car was in the driveway, so I used my old key to enter through the kitchen door. I found my father sitting at the dining room table, staring at a stack of papers with his head in his hands. "Dad," I said softly, not wanting to startle him. Robert looked up with a mixture of surprise and something that might have been shame. His face was haggard, and he had clearly been struggling with stress for days. "Grady, what are you doing here? How did you know about—" "Mom called me from the hospital. She's worried about you, and after talking to her, I'm worried too." I sat down across from him at the table where we had shared thousands of family meals. "Dad, tell me what's going on." Robert's composure cracked, and for the first time in my adult life, I saw my father cry. The story of his deal with Quick Cash Solutions came out in painful detail. His desperation after the IRS froze their accounts, the seemingly reasonable loan application, the escalating fees and threats, and the visit from Vincent and Carlo that had made the danger unmistakably clear. "They want $15,000 by 5 o'clock today," Robert said, checking his watch. "It's already past 2. I don't have the money, Grady. I've destroyed everything our family built, and now I've put your mother in danger." I felt a surge of protective anger that surprised me with its intensity. My parents had rejected me and thrown me out of their home, but the thought of criminals threatening them activated something primal in my character. "Dad, listen to me carefully," I said, pulling out my phone. "I can transfer $15,000 to any account you specify within the next 5 minutes. But before we do that, I need to understand exactly who we're dealing with." Robert stared at me in confusion. "Grady, where would you get $15,000? I thought you worked at the hardware store." The moment had arrived when I could no longer maintain the fiction that had defined our relationship for years. I showed Robert my phone, opening the banking app that displayed my primary account balance: $14,700,212. Robert's reaction was a mixture of shock, disbelief, and dawning understanding. I spent the next 20 minutes explaining Coinbridge, my success in the cryptocurrency industry, and my decision to hide my wealth to avoid disappointing them with my unconventional career path. You mean all this time, while we were worried about your future, you were already successful beyond anything we could have imagined? Robert asked. Dad, we can discuss all of that later. Right now, we need to deal with these loan sharks before they hurt someone. I transferred $25,000 to Robert's personal account, covering the demanded payment plus additional funds for any other immediate expenses. But as we were arranging the transfer, Marcus called with information that changed everything. Grady, Quick Cash Solutions is a front for the Torino crime family, Marcus explained. They're under federal investigation for money laundering, extortion, and loan sharking. Your father isn't just dealing with criminals, he's dealing with organized crime. The implications were clear. Even if we paid the current demand, the criminals would likely escalate their extortion attempts, viewing my family as a source of ongoing income. Money alone wouldn't solve this problem. We needed to eliminate the threat permanently. Marcus, what are our options? The FBI has been building a case against these people for 2 years. If your father is willing to cooperate, we might be able to turn this situation into an opportunity to gather evidence that could shut them down. I looked at Robert, who was listening to my side of the conversation with growing alarm. Dad, we have a choice. We can pay these criminals and hope they leave us alone, or we can work with the FBI to make sure they can never threaten anyone else. Robert's response surprised me. Despite his fear and stress, there was still enough of the principled man I remembered to make the right choice. If we can stop them from hurting other families, then that's what we should do. Marcus arranged for us to meet with FBI agent Sarah Collins, who had been leading the investigation into Quick Cash Solutions. The plan was risky but straightforward. I would accompany Robert to make the payment, wearing a wire to record any threats or admissions of criminal activity. Federal agents would be positioned nearby to make arrests once they had sufficient evidence. As we prepared for what might be the most dangerous afternoon of our lives, I realized that my relationship with my parents had fundamentally changed. We were no longer father and son divided by misunderstanding and disappointment. We were partners working together to protect our family and serve justice. The irony wasn't lost on me that it had taken a crisis involving organized crime to finally bridge the gap that years of success and achievement had been unable to cross. Agent Sarah Collins met us at the FBI field office in downtown Seattle, a stern woman in her 40s, whose professional demeanor couldn't quite hide her excitement about finally having an opportunity to take down Quick Cash Solutions. The conference room where we planned the operation was filled with surveillance equipment, photographs of known criminals, and detailed organizational charts showing the connections between various illegal enterprises. Mr. Patterson, what your son is proposing to do carries real risks, Agent Collins explained to Robert. These people have a history of violence when they feel threatened or cornered. However, your situation gives us an unprecedented opportunity to gather evidence that could put several dangerous criminals in prison for decades. The plan was carefully structured to maximize our safety while obtaining the evidence needed for successful prosecutions. I would accompany Robert to the Quick Cash Solutions office, ostensibly to help him make the required payment. Both of us would wear concealed recording devices that would capture any threats, admissions of criminal activity, or evidence of the organization's illegal structure. Agent Collins emphasized the importance of getting Vincent and Carlo to make explicit threats on tape. We need them to clearly state that they will harm you or your family if payments aren't made. We also need evidence of the usurious interest rates and hidden fees that constitute illegal lending practices. The recording equipment was sophisticated but nearly undetectable. The microphones were embedded in what appeared to be normal shirt buttons, while the recording devices were designed to look like everyday items we would naturally carry. Agent Collins tested the equipment thoroughly, ensuring that we could capture clear audio even in challenging acoustic environments. As we prepared to leave for the Quick Cash Solutions office, my phone buzzed with an urgent call from Jennifer, my assistant. Coinbridge's headquarters had received an unexpected visit from reporters asking questions about my family's connection to organized crime. Somehow, word of our situation had leaked to the media. Mr. Patterson, we may have a problem, Agent Collins said after I explained the call. If there's media attention, these criminals might change their behavior or become more dangerous. The decision to proceed despite the media attention was ultimately mine to make. I could have walked away, protected my business reputation, and simply paid the money to resolve the immediate threat. But as I looked at my father, who was preparing to risk his safety to help law enforcement, I realized that some things were more important than protecting my public image. "We're going through with the plan," I told Agent Collins. "These criminals need to be stopped, regardless of the impact on my business." The Quick Cash Solutions office looked even more shabby and illegitimate in the afternoon light than it had when Robert first visited. Federal agents were positioned in a surveillance van across the street, in the coffee shop next door, and in the apartment building that overlooked the storefront. Despite their presence, I felt vulnerable and exposed as we walked through the front door. Vincent and Carlo were waiting for us in Tony Markellis' office, their presence confirming that this meeting was more than a routine payment collection. Vincent's cold eyes immediately focused on me, clearly trying to assess this new player in their game. "Mr. Patterson, I see you brought a friend," Vincent said, his tone suggesting that my presence was unwelcome. "This is my son, Grady," Robert explained, his voice steadier than I had expected. "Has helping me with the payment." Carlo leaned forward in his chair, studying me with predatory interest. "What kind of work do you do, Grady?" "I work in financial services," I replied truthfully, knowing that the recording devices were capturing every word. Vincent laughed. "Financial services? That's interesting. Maybe you can explain to your father how compound interest works, because he seems to be having trouble understanding his obligations." The conversation continued as planned, with Vincent and Carlo making increasingly explicit threats about what would happen if payments weren't made on time. They detailed their collection methods, described other clients who had suffered consequences for late payments, and explained the escalating fee structure that would keep my family in debt indefinitely. "Mr. Patterson, you need to understand that this debt doesn't just disappear," Vincent said, staring directly at Robert. "We know where you live, where your wife is in the hospital, where your son works. We're very thorough about collecting what's owed to us." The threats were exactly what Agent Collins needed for criminal charges, but the operation took an unexpected turn when Robert's phone rang with a call from Harborview Medical Center. Helen had suffered another cardiac episode and was asking for both of us to come immediately. Robert's face went pale as he took the call. "We have to go," he told Vincent. "My wife is having a medical emergency." Vincent's expression hardened. "Mr. Patterson, we had an agreement about timing. Your family problems don't change our schedule." It was at that moment that the carefully planned operation began to unravel. Robert stood up to leave, but Carlo moved to block the door. Vincent's hand moved inside his jacket, suggesting he was armed. The situation was escalating beyond what the FBI had anticipated. "Gentlemen, let's all stay calm," I said, pulling out my phone. "I can transfer the money right now to resolve this situation." But as I opened my banking app, Vincent caught a glimpse of my account balance on the screen. His entire demeanor changed as he realized he was looking at millions of dollars rather than the modest savings account he had expected. Well, Vincent said, his voice taking on a dangerous edge. "It looks like we've been talking to the wrong Patterson." The revelation that I had significant wealth changed the entire dynamic of the confrontation. Vincent and Carlo suddenly saw an opportunity for a much larger score than they had originally planned. Instead of collecting $15,000 from a desperate small business owner, they were now looking at the possibility of extorting millions from a successful entrepreneur. "Grady Patterson," Carlo said, apparently recognizing my name. "I've seen you in the business news. Coinbridge, right? You're worth some serious money." The situation was spinning out of control. Vincent was making new demands, threatening my family unless I transferred a much larger sum to his accounts. Carlo was describing in graphic detail what would happen to Helen if I didn't cooperate. The criminals had abandoned any pretense of legitimate business and were moving into outright extortion and kidnapping threats. It was at that moment that I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of trying to negotiate or de-escalate the situation, I stood up and faced Vincent directly. "My name is Grady Patterson, and I'm the CEO of Coinbridge Financial Services," I said in a clear, strong voice that I knew would carry clearly on the recording devices. "You're demanding payment on a fraudulent loan with illegal interest rates. and you're threatening to harm my family if I don't pay you money. You're not legally entitled to collect." Vincent's hand moved toward his weapon, but before he could draw it, the office door burst open as FBI agents flooded the room. Agent Collins was in the lead, followed by 6 other agents in tactical gear. Within seconds, Vincent and Carlo were on the ground in handcuffs, while Tony Marcelli was being read his rights. "Grady Patterson, FBI." Agent Collins announced, "You're under arrest for extortion, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit violent crimes." But she was talking to Vincent, not to me. The confusion on the criminals' faces as they realized they had been recorded making threats against a federal cooperating witness was almost comical. As the arrested criminals were led away, Robert and I embraced in a moment of relief and genuine reconciliation. For the first time in years, we had worked together toward a common goal, and our cooperation had achieved something meaningful beyond our personal relationship. "Son," Robert said, "I'm proud of what you've accomplished, and I'm proud of the man you've become." The words I had wanted to hear for years finally came, but they meant more because they were earned through our shared courage, rather than simply granted because of my financial success. We rushed to the hospital together, partners now in every sense that mattered, to be with Helen as she recovered from her latest cardiac episode, and learned about the dramatic resolution of the crisis that had nearly destroyed our family. 3 weeks later, I stood in the doorway of my childhood home in Ballard. But this time I was arriving as a welcome guest rather than being thrown out as a failure. The modest 2-story house looked the same as it always had, but everything about our family dynamic had fundamentally changed. Helen was home from the hospital, her recovery aided by the dramatic reduction in stress that came with the resolution of their legal and financial troubles. The dining room table was set for 3. With my mother's good china that had been reserved for special occasions throughout my childhood. The familiar smell of her pot roast filled the house, triggering memories of countless family dinners when our biggest concern had been whether I would finish my vegetables or complete my homework on time. Robert opened the door before I could knock, his face showing a mixture of pride and residual amazement that still surfaced whenever he thought about my success. In the 3 weeks since the FBI operation, he had begun to understand not just the scope of my business achievements, but the character and integrity that had driven them. "Grady, come in," he said, embracing me with a warmth that had been absent from our relationship for years. "Your mother has been cooking all afternoon. She's determined to make up for all the family dinners we missed." Helen appeared from the kitchen, moving more slowly than I remembered, but with energy and purpose that had been missing during her hospital stay. The stress-related cardiac episodes had stopped completely once the threat from Quick Cash Solutions was eliminated and their financial problems were resolved. "My successful son," she said, hugging me tightly. "I still can't believe how wrong we were about everything." The transformation in our family relationships had been gradual but profound. In the immediate aftermath of the FBI operation, we had focused on practical matters, clearing up the legal issues surrounding Patterson Accounting Services, resolving the medical bills from Helen's hospitalization, and ensuring that the criminals who had threatened our family faced serious consequences in court. Vincent Torino and Carlo Benedetti had been charged with multiple federal crimes, including extortion, money laundering, and operating an illegal gambling enterprise. Tony Marcelli had cooperated with prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence, providing information that led to arrests throughout the criminal organization. The Quick Cash Solutions storefront had been shuttered permanently, and federal agents had seized assets worth over $2 million. But more important than the legal victories was the emotional healing that had taken place within our family. The crisis had forced us to confront years of misunderstanding and miscommunication, clearing the way for honest conversations about our expectations, disappointments, and hopes for the future. During Helen's recovery period, I had spent countless hours at the hospital and their home, gradually rebuilding the trust and intimacy that had been damaged by years of hiding my success. I explained the decisions I had made to conceal my wealth, my desire to earn their approval through traditional means, and my fear that revealing my unconventional path to success would create even more disappointment. Robert had been equally forthcoming about his and Helen's mistakes. They acknowledged that their rigid expectations and dismissive attitude toward my choices had driven me to feel that I needed to hide my achievements. They realized that their definition of success had been too narrow to appreciate the innovative work I was doing in an emerging industry. We were so focused on the path we thought you should take that we couldn't see the path you were actually taking, Robert had explained during one of our hospital conversations. We let our fear of your failure blind us to your success. The practical aspects of rebuilding their lives had been straightforward once my resources were available to help. I had quietly settled all of their legal bills, medical expenses, and business debts, while working with their attorney to clear their names in the IRS investigation. The charges related to Dave Thompson's embezzlement scheme had been dropped. Once, federal investigators confirmed that Patterson Accounting Services had been victims rather than accomplices. More significantly, I had proposed a plan that would allow my parents to maintain their dignity and professional purpose while benefiting from my success. Instead of simply giving them money, I had offered them positions within CoinBridges, expanding operations that would utilize their decades of experience in accounting and financial management. Helen had accepted a role as senior financial advisor for CoinBridge's client services division, where her conservative approach to money management provided valuable balance to our more aggressive investment strategies. Her understanding of traditional accounting principles helped our clients integrate cryptocurrency transactions with their existing financial systems. Robert had become our compliance and regulatory affairs consultant, using his knowledge of tax law and business regulations to ensure that CoinBridge's operations met all federal and state requirements. His meticulous attention to detail and conservative approach to rule following had already identified several potential compliance issues that could have become serious problems. The arrangement satisfied everyone's needs. My parents were able to contribute their skills to meaningful work that paid them well, while I gained the benefit of their experience and wisdom in building CoinBridge's long-term stability. Most importantly, they were able to feel proud of their association with my company rather than ashamed of their earlier lack of support. As we sat down to dinner that evening, Helen raised her glass of sparkling cider in a toast to second chances and first-time honesty. She said, echoing words I had spoken during one of our hospital conversations. To family, Robert added, and to the understanding that success comes in many forms. To the future, I concluded, and to never letting pride keep us apart again. The conversation during dinner ranged across topics that had been off-limits for years. Helen asked detailed questions about CoinBridge's technology and my vision for the company's expansion into new markets. Robert offered suggestions about regulatory strategies and risk management based on his decades of experience with financial compliance. But perhaps most importantly, we talked about personal matters, with an openness that had been missing from our relationship since my teenage years. I shared my hopes for eventually starting a family of my own, and my desire to find someone who could appreciate both my professional success and my commitment to family values. Helen and Robert talked about their dreams for retirement and their excitement about becoming more involved in their community now that their financial stress had been eliminated. As the evening drew to a close, I reflected on the unexpected path that had led us to this moment of reconciliation. Being thrown out of my childhood home had initially felt like the ultimate rejection, but it had ultimately forced all of us to confront the walls of misunderstanding that had separated us for years. The crisis with quick cash solutions had been terrifying and dangerous, but it had also provided an opportunity for Robert and me to work together as partners, rather than as disappointed father and ungrateful son. Facing a common threat had revealed the love and mutual respect that had been hidden beneath years of frustration and miscommunication. Helen's medical emergency had been a wake-up call about the fragility of family relationships and the importance of not taking our connections for granted. The stress-induced cardiac episodes had served as a physical manifestation of the emotional damage that our family conflicts had caused, while her recovery paralleled the healing of our relationships. Most significantly, I had learned that true success wasn't measured only in financial terms or business achievements. The wealth I had accumulated meant nothing if I couldn't share it with people who loved and supported me. The recognition I had received in the business world was hollow if it came at the cost of estrangement from my family. The experience had also taught me valuable lessons about communication and honesty in relationships. My decision to hide my success, while well-intentioned, had created a barrier that prevented my parents from understanding and appreciating my achievements. Their assumption that my unconventional path indicated failure had closed their minds to the possibility that I might be building something valuable and meaningful. As I prepared to leave that evening, Helen pulled me aside for a private conversation. "Grady, I want you to know that your father and I are going to spend the rest of our lives making up for the years we didn't support you properly," she said. "We may not always understand everything about your business, but we understand that you're a good man who has achieved something remarkable." "Mom, you don't need to make up for anything," I replied. "What matters is that we're together now, and we're not going to let misunderstandings keep us apart in the future." Robert joined us in the entryway, and for a moment we stood together as a family that had been tested by crisis and emerged stronger than before. The modest home where I had grown up now felt like the foundation for a relationship that could weather any future challenges. As I drove back to my penthouse that evening, I realized that the events of the past month had given me something more valuable than any business contract or financial return. I had my family back, not because I had finally proven my worth to them, but because we had all learned to value each other for who we really were, rather than who we thought the other person should be. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on me. I had spent years trying to earn my parents' approval through conventional success, only to discover that the path to reconciliation led through unconventional danger and shared courage. The son who had been thrown out for being a useless failure had returned as a successful businessman, but more importantly, as a family member who was finally understood and appreciated. 6 months later, CoinBridge announced the launch of our new social impact division, dedicated to helping families in financial crisis navigate their challenges without falling victim to predatory lenders or illegal schemes. Helen and Robert became the public faces of this initiative, using their experience with financial crime to educate other small business owners about the warning signs of dangerous lending practices. The division's first year prevented an estimated 47 families from falling victim to loan sharks, while providing legitimate financial assistance to over 200 small businesses facing temporary difficulties. The program became a model for other financial technology companies, demonstrating that business success and social responsibility could be pursued simultaneously. For me, the Social Impact Division represented the perfect synthesis of everything I had learned about family, business, and personal values. By helping other families avoid the crisis that had nearly destroyed mine, we were turning our painful experience into something positive and meaningful. The program also provided my parents with a sense of purpose and accomplishment that went beyond their individual roles within CoinBridge. They were able to use their experience to prevent other families from suffering similar trauma, while building stronger relationships with each other and with me through our shared commitment to helping others. Looking back on the events that began with my being thrown out of my childhood home, I realized that every challenge we had faced had ultimately strengthened our family bonds and clarified our values. The pain of rejection had led to the joy of reconciliation. The danger of criminal threats had revealed the depth of our mutual love and commitment. The stress of financial crisis had demonstrated the healing power of honest communication and shared purpose. Most importantly, I had learned that true success in life comes not from achieving individual goals, but from building relationships that can withstand any test and support any dream. The millions of dollars in my bank account were less significant than the restored trust between my parents and me. The recognition I had received as a business leader was less meaningful than the pride I saw in Helen and Robert's faces when they talked about our family's journey. As I ended this reflection on the most challenging and rewarding period of my life, I realized that every family faces moments when love and understanding are tested by pride, fear, or misunderstanding. The key to surviving those tests is maintaining hope that reconciliation is possible, even when the gaps between us seem impossible to bridge. Sometimes it takes a crisis to reveal the strength of family bonds. Sometimes it requires courage to admit our mistakes and forgive the mistakes of others. But most importantly, it demands a willingness to choose love over pride, understanding over judgment, and togetherness over being right. Now, I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever experienced a situation where family misunderstandings created barriers that seemed impossible to overcome? How did you find the courage to bridge those gaps and rebuild those relationships? Share your story in the comments below because your experience might inspire someone else who is struggling with similar family challenges. If this story resonated with you, please hit the like button to let me know it touched your heart. Subscribe to hear more stories about families who found their way back to each other despite seemingly impossible odds. And please share this story with someone who might need to hear that reconciliation is always possible when we approach each other with love, honesty, and the willingness to admit our mistakes. Thank you for taking this emotional journey with me. And remember that every family has the potential for healing and growth, no matter how broken the relationships might seem. Sometimes the greatest successes in life come not from what we achieve individually, but from what we rebuild together.